If you buy a ticket to Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire today, one of England's most magnificent houses, the tour guide will, sooner or later, lead you to the north portico. You will be told to look up. There, several meters high, from the ceiling, huge, eerily blue eyes will gaze down at you. They were painted almost 100 years ago. They watch every tourist, every descendant of Winston Churchill passing over these slabs. The guides will politely explain that these are the eyes of the second wife of the 9th Duke of Marlborough, Gladys Deacon. They will say that she was the most beautiful woman of her time. They will mention that Marcel Proust wrote about her with bated breath, and the sculptor Rodin dreamed of sculpting her profile. But the tour guide will fall silent and not tell you what happened to the owner of these eyes. He will not tell you how this story of dazzling beauty ended. Because the finale of this fairy tale smells not of French perfumes and old paper, but of ammonia, spoiled food, and dog excrement. Let's fast forward to 1962. Remote English countryside, the village of Chacombe. Police and orderlies in heavy boots are breaking down the door of a farmhouse that locals avoid. Inside, there is an unbearable stench. The windows are boarded up. There is no electricity. The rooms are buried under mountains of trash as tall as a person. Old newspapers, empty tin cans, rotten rags. Amid this chaos, barricading the entrance with herself, stands a hunched old woman of 81. She growls at the intruders like a wild animal. Her gray hair is matted into a tangle, and she is wearing several layers of dirty clothes. The orderlies grab her by the arms. She resists with superhuman strength. This is a forced hospitalization in St. Andrew's Psychiatric Hospital. The doctors diagnose senile dementia and profound paranoia. But the most terrifying thing about this woman is her face. It is gone. Instead of the features that once drove European kings mad, a grotesque mask is frozen on her face. The chin is deformed and hangs in heavy, lumpy folds. The bridge of the nose has spread. The skin resembles wax that has been held too long near the fire. When the orderlies begin to clear the piles of trash in her house for disinfection, they will find strange things. Under a pile of rotting newspapers, they will discover a diamond tiara wrapped in oily paper from under fish. In a cookie tin, there will be pearls worthy of a queen. And in an old suitcase, letters from the most influential men of the 20th century, begging her for a meeting. The woman who was just taken to the madhouse was named Gladys Marie Deacon. The irony of fate is that she destroyed herself not with drugs or alcohol. It killed her, that which millions of social media users strive for today. It killed her, the manic desire to improve her appearance. Gladys Deacon became the first victim of modern cosmetology long before the invention of Botox and fillers. In the early 20th century, when medicine still bordered on shamanism, she decided to correct nature. She didn't want to be just beautiful. She wanted to be divine. She demanded a perfect Greek profile, a straight line from the forehead to the tip of the nose without a single indentation. And she found a doctor who agreed to inject hot paraffin under her skin. Paraffin. Ordinary paraffin. She didn't know that this material had a tendency to migrate. Over time, under the influence of gravity and body heat, the paraffin began to drip downward, accumulating in the chin and forming monstrous tumors that doctors call paraffinomas. Her legendary beauty, her main asset into which she invested her entire life, literally melted away. This story has everything we love. Mad money, the greatest palaces in the world, stolen husbands, and retribution that came with biblical cruelty. We will see how a murderer's daughter became a duchess. We will calculate how much each of her steps to the altar cost. We will peek into the account books of Blenheim Palace and see how the world's most desired woman turned into a recluse who banned mirrors in her house. Forget romantic fairy tales about aristocratic love. Before you is a medical history. A history of narcissism elevated to the absolute. A story about what happens when a person tries to buy eternal youth from God, but pays with their sanity. Gladys Deacon wanted to be looked at forever, and she achieved it. Her eyes still gaze from the palace ceiling, while her body rotted in an unmarked grave. To understand why a woman would decide to inject hot wax into her face, we must go back 30 years. We must find ourselves not in the operating room, but in the corridor of the luxurious Splendid Hotel in French Cannes. The date is February 18, 1892. Exactly on this day, the childhood of 11-year-old Gladys Deacon ended, and her war with reality began. Her father, Edward Parker Deacon, was a wealthy Boston banker, but this was not the type of wealth we saw in the Rockefellers or Carnegies. These were the so-called old money, New England aristocracy. Edward was a man with an unstable psyche, explosive temperament, and pathological jealousy. And, unfortunately, he had reasons for this jealousy. His wife, Gladys's mother, Florence Baldwin, was a socialite of the sort for whom flirting was as necessary as air. She collected men just as her husband collected problems. That evening, Edward Deacon returned to the hotel unexpectedly. He went up to their suite, clutching a revolver in his pocket. In the room, he found not only his wife, but also the French diplomat Émile Abel. The scene was classic, as if from a cheap pulp novel. But the consequences were fatal. Edward didn't shout. He simply drew his weapon. 3 shots tore through the silence of the velvet season in Cannes. Émile Abel collapsed onto the carpet, staining the expensive French patterns with blood. He didn't die immediately, but later in the hospital, in agony. The scandal was colossal. It wasn't just murder. It was the public destruction of the family's reputation. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic savored every detail. What the unfaithful wife was wearing, the caliber of the revolver, how exactly the dying lover screamed. Gladys was there. She saw and heard everything. The girl who should have been learning to play the piano and embroider received the main lesson of her life. Love is weakness. Love is blood on the carpet. Passion leads to prison or death. Gladys's father was arrested. He was tried, found guilty, but soon transferred from prison to McLean Psychiatric Hospital in Massachusetts. There, behind high walls, in the ward for the violent, he ended his days in 1901. The man who gave Gladys her surname and starting capital went mad. This fear of ending up like her father would haunt her all her life. She was panic-strickenly afraid of madness, but it was exactly to that she would come in the end. After her father's arrest, Gladys's life turned into chaos. Her mother, disgraced but not broken, took her daughters and began an endless journey through Europe. They became upper-class nomads, without a home, without roots, but with Louis Vuitton suitcases and maids. It was during this period, in her teenage years, that Gladys makes the decision that will determine her fate. She decides to become invulnerable. She understands that the only currency that matters for a woman in this cruel world is not virtue, not modesty, but exclusivity. She begins to build herself as a project, as a skyscraper. While other girls studied to make a successful marriage, Gladys studied to dominate. By the age of 16, she spoke 7 languages fluently. She could discuss philosophy with Sorbonne professors and art with museum directors. She read voraciously, devouring books by the hundreds. But this was not a pursuit of enlightenment. It was an arms race. She honed her intellect like a blade. But her main weapon became her appearance. Contemporaries described her beauty as terrifying. It was not the prettiness of a doll. It was the beauty of a predator. Huge blue-green eyes that seemed to see right through a person. Perfect white skin. She knew what impression she made and knew how to use it. Already at 14, she set a goal for herself, a specific, cynical, ambitious goal. She read in the newspapers about the wedding of Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough. It was the most sensational wedding of the century. American money bought a British title. Gladys looked at the Duke's photograph, at his Blenheim palace, and said to herself, "I will take this. I will be the next Duchess of Marlborough." It sounded like the ravings of a madwoman. The Duke was married, he had heirs, and Gladys was the daughter of a murderer, a madman who died in an asylum. She didn't have the millions of the Vanderbilts. Her dowry was modest by high society standards. But she had a plan. She decided to become so beautiful and so interesting that the Duke simply wouldn't be able to resist. She began the hunt. She attended the same resorts, the same balls. She befriended Consuelo Vanderbilt herself, the wife of her target. Imagine this level of cynicism. She became the best friend of the woman whose place she planned to take. She entered their home, played with their children, charmed their guests. She behaved like a virus that penetrates the body and waits for the moment to take control. Gladys wasn't looking for love. She was looking for a throne. She saw Blenheim Palace not just as a home, but as a fortress where no one could touch her, where no one would remember that her father shot a man in a hotel. The title of Duchess was armor for her. By 20, she had become a phenomenon. They talked about her in Paris, London, and Rome. The poet Gabriel D'Annunzio fell to his knees before her. Marcel Proust wrote her letters, admiring her intellect. But Gladys looked down on them. She didn't need poets. She needed a crown. She was ready for anything for this. And when nature, as it seemed to her, made a mistake in her face, a tiny indentation on the bridge of the nose, she decided to correct that too, because the future queen must be flawless. Thus ends the stage of building the foundation. The girl from the splendid hotel room has grown up. She is smart, she is dangerous, and she is absolutely ruthless. Ahead lies the beginning of the big game, where the stake will not be just a man's heart, but one of England's greatest names. The beginning of the 20th century. Europe is experiencing its last, brightest, and most decadent carnival before choking on the blood of the First World War. This is the era that the French will call Belle Époque, and the British, Edwardian summer. A time when champagne flowed like a river, and diamonds were measured not in carats, but in kilograms. In this sparkling carousel, Gladys Deacon took a seat in the front row. She was not just a participant in high society, she was its main trophy. Imagine a woman who rejects the heir to the German throne. Wilhelm, Crown Prince of Prussia, the future Kaiser, was so enchanted by her that he gave her a ring, which she accepted, but did not marry him. Too boring, she decided. The Duke of Norfolk, the first peer of England, a man whose fortune could buy a small country, courted her. She rejected him, too. She didn't need just money or just a title. She needed worship. Gladys Deacon created a cult around herself. Unlike other society beauties who knew only how to smile sweetly and change outfits from Charles Worth, Gladys was an intellectual monster. She turned her erudition into a fetish. Art historian Bernard Berenson, whose taste was considered law, called her a miracle. Marcel Proust, the great recluse and analyst of human souls, wrote about her with reverence bordering on religious ecstasy. "I have never seen a girl with such beauty, such magnificent intellect, such kindness and charm." She played with these men like a cat with mice. She took pleasure in making philosophers blush and dukes stutter. But behind this facade of triumph lurked rot. Gladys was a golden vagabond. She had no home of her own. She lived in guest bedrooms of other people's palaces, parasitizing on the hospitality of friends, including that of the Duke of Marlborough and his wife Consuelo. She slept on silk sheets that weren't hers, and ate from golden plates she couldn't afford to buy. This gave rise to a monstrous inferiority complex mixed with megalomania in her. She had to be not just better than others, she had to become ideal, absolute, divine. And here begins the most chilling chapter of her golden age. Gladys looked in the mirror and found a flaw: her profile. It seemed to her that a tiny, natural indentation between the forehead and nose made her ordinary. She dreamed of a Greek profile, a perfectly straight line found only on ancient statues. Such anatomy is not inherent to living people, but Gladys didn't want to be a living person. She wanted to be the statue Galatea brought to life. In 1903, at the age of 22, she finds a doctor willing to fulfill her mad whim. Cosmetology in the modern sense did not exist. It was a zone of experiments bordering on crime. Doctors were only beginning to try injections for appearance correction. And the most popular material of that time was paraffin. Hot, liquid, wax. Think about it. A girl with a brilliant education, reading Plato in the original, voluntarily agrees to a procedure that would make any dermatologist faint today. The doctor injects melted paraffin under the skin of her nose bridge. While the wax hasn't hardened, he molds her new nose shape with his fingers, like a sculptor working with clay. The pain was hellish, but when the swelling subsided, Gladys looked in the mirror and saw what she wanted. The line was straight. She had achieved it. She had corrected nature. The world gasped at her new, otherworldly beauty. She looked like a goddess descended from Olympus. No one knew that inside her face, a time bomb was planted. This was the apotheosis of vanity in the Gilded Age. On the outside, a dazzling, flawless facade created artificially. Inside, a foreign body, a chemical substance that would inevitably conflict with living tissue. But for now, in the early 20th century, Gladys celebrated victory. She continued her siege of Blenheim Palace. She became the shadow of the Duke of Marlborough. While his lawful wife Consuelo engaged in charity and tried to save face in an unhappy marriage, Gladys was slowly but steadily displacing her. She was smarter than Consuelo. She was brighter, and now, with her Greek profile, she felt invincible. Society whispered. Everyone saw this strange triangle: the unhappy wife, the cold duke, and the dazzling predator living under their roof. Gladys was not embarrassed. At balls, she appeared in outfits that violated all rules of decency, but were so luxurious that no one dared reproach her. She wore tiaras as if born in them, but the gold of the era was already beginning to fade. Doctors warned that paraffin could be dangerous, but who listens to doctors when eternal youth is at stake? Gladys was convinced that the laws of physics and biology did not apply to her. She believed she had struck a deal with eternity. No one at that moment could have foreseen the price of this deal. No one knew that this perfect wax nose would become her curse, that the substance meant to make her the most beautiful woman in the world would, in a few years, begin to melt, drip, and turn her face into a mask from a horror movie. But for now, the music plays, the champagne is ice cold, and the laughter rings out. Gladys Deacon stands on the terrace, her profile flawless in the moonlight, and she believes the whole world lies at her feet. She doesn't yet know that she has already lost. She is the living embodiment of her era, a beautiful wrapper concealing a catastrophe beneath. And when this catastrophe strikes, it will be as loud and destructive as the fall of the great dynasties whose money and attention she so greedily fed upon. In the high society of the Edwardian era, there were no machine guns or trenches, but the war there was no less brutal than on the battlefields. Only instead of shrapnel, rumors were wielded here, and instead of snipers on rooftops, grandes dames sat in drawing rooms, ready to destroy anyone's reputation with a single raised eyebrow. And in this war, Gladys Deacon was a suicide saboteur. According to the unwritten rules of old money, Gladys had no right even to stand in the hallway of high society. She bore a stigma, a black mark. She was not just an American, which was already deemed vulgar. She was that girl from Cannes, daughter of a murderer, daughter of a madman. In a world where lineage was valued more than gold, her family tree was poisoned by gunpowder and madness. Any other woman with such a background would have quietly married a provincial lawyer and been grateful to fate. But Gladys declared war on the hierarchy. Her strategy was brilliant and cynical. If you can't be respectable, become scandalous. If they don't accept you as an equal, make them fear you like a predator. She turned her dubious reputation into an exotic brand. While dollar princesses like Consuelo Vanderbilt bought entry tickets to society for millions of their father's dollars, Gladys breached the walls with the battering ram of her intellect. She understood the main weakness of the British aristocracy: deadly boredom. Dukes and earls died of tedium at their endless dinners, discussing fox hunting and the weather. Gladys burst into this musty world like a hurricane. She talked about sex when it was proper to talk about tea. She discussed politics when women were supposed to be silent. She quoted Nietzsche and argued with prime ministers. It was unheard of audacity. Men looked at her like mesmerized rabbits at a cobra. Women hated her with such force that if looks could kill, Gladys would have died 1,000 times. But her main goal remained Blenheim Palace, and here unfolded the dirtiest part of this social war. The Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill, known as Sonny, was a complicated man. Arrogant, cold, obsessed with the greatness of his lineage, he was unhappy in his marriage to Consuelo. Their union was the most famous deal of the century: Vanderbilt money in exchange for the Marlborough title. But love was not stipulated in this contract. Gladys chose the Trojan horse tactic. She did not become Consuelo's enemy. On the contrary, she became her closest friend. She visited their home for months. She comforted Consuelo when she cried from loneliness, and at the same time charmed her husband over dinner. It was a Machiavellian move of the highest order. Imagine this scene. The huge dining hall of Blenheim. 3 sit at the table. The lawful wife who wants to escape, the Duke who needs worship, and Gladys, beautiful, dangerous, with that very Greek profile which still holds its shape. She plays on their contradictions like on a piano. She gave Sonny what Consuelo could not: intellectual superiority and a sense of danger. With Gladys, he felt alive. She was a dark mirror in which his own vanity was reflected, magnified. But society resisted. When it became clear that Gladys was aiming for the Duchess's position, the doors of many houses slammed shut before her. She was called an adventuress. Respectable matrons forbade their sons to dance with her. It was a war of attrition. Gladys waited. She waited for years, decades. In 1906, the Duke's marriage to Consuelo effectively collapsed. They separated. The path seemed open. But divorce at that time was a shameful and lengthy affair. Gladys found herself in limbo. She was the official mistress, the favorite, but not the wife. This was the most humiliating status for a woman of that era. You sit in a golden cage, but the keys are not yours. You wear diamonds, but you're not invited to the coronation. Gladys endured this for 15 years. 15 years she was a shadow by the Duke's side. During this time, her beauty began to change. That very wax injected into the bridge of her nose began its insidious movement. First, there were barely noticeable changes in skin color. Then, puffiness appeared. Gladys applied layers of powder, thicker and thicker. She began to wear veils. But she did not retreat. She had invested her entire life into this stock called Duke of Marlborough, and she was not going to sell it at a loss. In 1921, when Gladys was already 40 years old, an age that in the early 20th century was considered the sunset for a woman, the incredible happened. The Duke finally got a divorce. The social war reached its climax. Gladys won. She withstood the condemnation of society, time, morality. She got the ring. She became Her Grace the Duchess of Marlborough. But victory in a social war often turns out to be Pyrrhic. On her wedding day, she stood at the altar not as a young nymph, but as a tired woman with the beginning decay of face and soul. She conquered the peak, but standing on it, she realized a terrible thing. The air here is thin and icy. And the man for whom she spent 20 years of her life turned out not to be a handsome prince, but a despotic neurotic who loved his palace more than any living being. She entered Blenheim as the mistress. She defeated all the countesses and baronesses who whispered behind her back, but she did not yet know that this palace would become not her trophy, but her mausoleum. The war for status ended. The war for survival in a golden cage began. To understand the full scale of the tragedy that would unfold behind the closed doors of Blenheim Palace, one must realize the economic model of marriages of that time. It was a market. Cynical, harsh, stock market, where instead of stocks, they traded living people, and dividends were coats of arms and invitations to royal receptions. At the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, the British aristocracy found itself on the brink of bankruptcy. Their estates, these huge stone leviathans, required astronomical sums for maintenance. Roofs leaked, foundations rotted, and rent from farmers fell. Salvation came from across the ocean. American nouveau riche, kings of railroads and steel, had mountains of cash, but lacked the main thing: history. They needed class. The British needed money. Thus was born the industry of dollar princesses. The Duke of Marlborough, Sonny, had already pulled off such a deal once. In 1895, he married Consuelo Vanderbilt. It was a shotgun wedding. Consuelo's mother literally forced her daughter to marry by threatening a heart attack. The Duke received $2.5 million, which converted at 2025 rates amounts to about $85 million. With this money, he repaired the palace roof, installed electricity, and renovated the gardens. Consuelo was not a wife. She was a living ATM that also bore an heir. Gladys Deacon knew these rules, but her deal in 1921 was different. It was unique. Gladys was not an heiress to the Vanderbilt Empire. Her fortune was respectable, providing a comfortable life, but it could not cover the duchy's debts. She could not buy the Duke's love with a check. Therefore, she offered a different currency. She offered him worship. June 25, 1921, Paris, British Consulate. No grand cathedrals, no crowds of guests weeping with emotion. Divorced people were not allowed to marry in church with pomp. It was a dry, businesslike procedure. Gladys Deacon, who had turned 40, and Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, who was 49, put their signatures in the registry book. The contract was concluded. For Gladys, this was a moment of absolute triumph. She received the title for which she sacrificed her youth. Now she was to be addressed as Your Grace. All those who had closed doors to her were now obliged to curtsy. She bought herself a place in history. But what did the Duke buy? Sonny was a deeply traumatized and incredibly difficult man. He was a misanthrope, obsessed with his own greatness and the greatness of his house. He needed not just a wife, he needed a curator for his museum. He needed a woman who would love Blenheim as fanatically as he himself did. Consuelo hated this cold palace. Gladys, however, idolized it. She sold the Duke the illusion that she was the ideal mistress for his stone idol. She convinced him that her intellect and taste would make Blenheim the center of Europe's intellectual life. But in this deal, there was a hidden defect that became apparent almost immediately: vanity. In a marriage of convenience, there is always a dominant partner. In the marriage with Consuelo, the Duke dominated because the money was already in his account, and the wife was meek. In the marriage with Gladys, two colossal egos collided. Two narcissists locked themselves in one cage. The Duke believed he had acquired a beautiful decoration for his drawing room, a smart conversationalist who would entertain him at dinner and be silent when he was tired. He thought Gladys would be grateful to him for the status. He was wrong. Gladys was not going to be a decoration. She was going to be the director. Immediately after the wedding, she began to behave not like a wife, but like a conqueror. She criticized the palace routines. She interfered in management. But the worst thing, she demanded attention. Gladys was used to being the sun around which planets revolve. But in Blenheim, there was only one sun, the Duke himself. The first cracks in this deal of the century appeared already during the honeymoon. It turned out that their intellectual conversations, which so captivated the Duke when Gladys was his mistress, now irritated him. Her habit of arguing, which had previously seemed piquant, was now perceived as a breach of subordination. And Gladys realized with horror that the title does not change reality. She became a duchess, but her husband was a boring, despotic, and cold man who in the evenings preferred to reread the palace inventory lists rather than talk about poetry. She sold her freedom for a crown of fake gold. Moreover, her currency, her beauty, was rapidly depreciating. The paraffin in her face continued its destructive work. Shortly after the wedding, the Duke began to notice strange lumps on his wife's face. The wax mask was beginning to melt. The goods he had acquired turned out to be defective. This was a classic conflict of expectations. He wanted an obedient statue, She wanted power. Both believed they had been deceived by the other, and when the euphoria of victory passed, they were left alone in the huge, drafty palace, with the realization that this deal would be their sentence. Gladys thought that the wedding was the finish line, after which eternal bliss follows. In fact, it was the starting shot to years of hell, mutual humiliations, and a cold war that would unfold in the corridors of one of England's most beautiful buildings. She got the title, but lost the right to happiness. And the price of this loss would grow every day, like interest on a predatory loan. Blenheim Palace is not a home. It is a stone monster disguised as an architectural masterpiece. It is the only non-royal and non-episcopal country house in England that bears the title palace. It was built at the beginning of the 18th century by architect John Vanbrugh, and he built it not so that people could live comfortably there. He was building a decoration for a military triumph. When Gladys Deacon moved in here, she found herself inside a building that occupies almost 3 hectares of land. There are 187 rooms, but in none of them could one feel warmth. Let's walk through these corridors. Imagine the scale. To simply go from the Duchess's bedroom to the dining room, one had to undertake a small journey. Ceilings 10 meters high absorbed any sound. The human voice here turned into a pitiful squeak. Walls were hung with tapestries depicting the bloody battles of the Duke's ancestor, John Churchill. You wake up and see war. You go to breakfast and see war. Daily life in this palace was organized with military precision and absurd cruelty. An army of servants, more than 40 inside the house and dozens more gardeners outside, worked like an invisible mechanism. Each footman had his own narrowly specialized function. There was a person whose sole task was to clean and refill the oil lamps. There was a person who ironed the morning newspapers with an iron so that the printer's ink wouldn't stain the Duke's hands. This was architecture of power. The Duke of Marlborough, Sonny, was a fanatic of etiquette. He used this house as a weapon against his own wife. He insisted that every dinner be conducted like a state ceremony, even if they dined alone. Imagine this scene that chills the blood. A long mahogany table designed for 30 people, candles in massive silver candelabras. At one end of the table sits the Duke. At the other, 15 meters away from him, Gladys. Between them, a desert of polished wood and cold porcelain. To tell her husband, "Pass the salt," one had to raise one's voice. But raising one's voice was forbidden by etiquette. Therefore, they sat in deathly silence. Food often arrived at the table cold. Blenheim's kitchens were so far from the dining room that even running footmen couldn't deliver the dishes hot. This was life in a golden refrigerator. Gladys tried to fight the house. She tried to tame it, but her methods were eccentric and frightening. If Consuelo Vanderbilt simply suffered, Gladys went on the offensive. It was during this period, in the late 1920s, that she left her most famous visual trace. She hires artist Colin Gill to paint the ceiling of the north portico. She orders him to paint her eyes. Huge, blue, all-seeing eyes. This was an act of incredible narcissism and despair. Gladys understood that she was losing control over reality, over her husband, over her own beauty, which was melting under the wax. And she decided to immortalize her gaze. "I will watch you from above, even when I'm gone," she seemed to say. The Duke hated this painting, but Gladys insisted. These eyes became a symbol of her attempt to subdue the space that rejected her. Her second attack on the palace order was more chaotic. Dogs. Gladys began breeding Blenheim Spaniels. But not one or two pets, there were dozens of them. They ran across priceless carpets, chewed on 18th century antique furniture, and relieved themselves in the corners of ballrooms. The Duke, for whom every scratch on the parquet was a personal tragedy, flew into a rage. For him, the palace was a temple, a museum. For Gladys, it became a kennel. This was her way of saying, "I'm alive here, and you are just the keeper of a tomb." Tension grew every day. Documents preserved evidence that dinners were becoming increasingly strange. Gladys began bringing a loaded revolver to the table. She placed it next to her soup plate. She did not threaten directly. She simply placed it on the tablecloth, a small, shiny, deadly object among the silver forks. The Duke asked, "What is this for, dear?" She replied with a mysterious smile, "Just in case, Sonny. Times are restless these days." In reality, this was a cry for help. She was bored to madness. She was lonely to the point of hallucinations. Isolation in Blenheim was destroying her psyche faster than the paraffin was destroying her face. She was Europe's smartest woman, locked in the wilderness with a man who did not want to hear her. Luxury no longer pleased. Carrara marble seemed like a tombstone. Tapestries on the walls choked with dust. Gladys began to understand that this house sucked life out of people to sustain its own grandeur. Blenheim did not need residents. It needed victims. By the end of the 1920s, the palace was finally divided into two warring camps. The Duke barricaded himself in his wing, surrounded by servant spies. Gladys took up defense in her apartments, surrounded by dogs and books. The great love, for which fates were broken, turned into a siege. It was here, in these cold rooms, that Gladys began to lose touch with the world. She stopped looking in mirrors because the reflection frightened her. But she was still watching her husband, with her eyes painted on the ceiling, not realizing that the finale was already written. And this finale would not be in the palace bedroom, but in dirt and oblivion. By the beginning of the 1930s, Blenheim Palace had turned into a set for a Gothic horror film. From the outside, it was still the same majestic monument to British glory, which tourists and politicians strived to visit. But inside, behind the heavy oak doors, the air was poisoned with hatred, fear, and the smell of decay. What the doctors had warned about 30 years earlier began to come true with nightmarish precision. The subcutaneous paraffin, which once gave her the perfect Greek profile, entered into an irreversible reaction with the tissues. Gravity proved to be a merciless sculptor. The wax flowed downward. It began to accumulate in the lower part of the face, forming heavy, lumpy thickenings on the chin. Gladys, who had worshipped her beauty all her life, now watched in horror as her face turned into a shapeless mask. Red, inflamed spots appeared. She tried to hide it with a thick layer of makeup, but the skin's texture could not be covered up. The woman who had been called a wonder of the world now avoided bright light. She ordered the curtains in her apartments to be drawn. Semi-darkness became her only ally. But the rot touched not only the flesh, it was corroding her mind. Having lost control over her face, Gladys tried to compensate by exerting total control over the space around her. Her behavior became not just eccentric, but frightening. Blenheim Palace, this temple of order, she turned into chaos. The main agents of this chaos were her dogs. She bred a whole pack of Blenheim Spaniels. These were not well-trained pets, but a wild horde to which everything was permitted. They slept on 18th century beds, tore priceless silk upholstery with their claws, and, most horrifying for the prim servants, relieved themselves right on the Persian carpets in the grand halls. the smell of dog urine mixed with the scent of Gladys's expensive perfumes, creating a nauseating atmosphere of decay. The Duke of Marlborough, a man for whom order was a religion, was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He watched as the woman he had brought into the house as a decoration methodically destroyed his legacy. He tried to fight back. He fired servants who indulged the Duchess's whims. He forbade her from entering certain wings of the palace. But this only spurred Gladys on. She began a guerrilla war. There is a known incident when, during a formal dinner attended by important political figures, Gladys began loudly discussing intimate details of their marital life. The Duke turned pale with rage. The guests buried their faces in their plates, wishing they could sink through the floor. Gladys reveled in this effect. If she could no longer be the most beautiful, she decided to become the most scandalous. Her jealousy grew into paranoia. It seemed to her that the Duke and the servants were conspiring against her. She began writing strange letters full of accusations. In her diaries from that time, the handwriting becomes jagged, thoughts jumbled. She accused her husband of stealing her youth. And in a sense, she was right. He took her best version. And now, when the goods had spoiled, he wanted to arrange a return. The Duke of Marlborough, in turn, found solace in religion and hatred. In 1927, he converted to Catholicism. Officially, this was needed to attempt annulling his first marriage to Consuelo, but in fact, it became yet another wall between him and Gladys, who was an atheist and mocked his piety. The situation reached a boiling point when Gladys stopped letting anyone into her bedroom. She barricaded herself. She lived in filth, among scraps and dogs, in one of the most luxurious rooms in Europe. This was a protest. This was a cry of despair. She wanted Sonny to see not the Duchess, but a person who was in pain. But Sonny saw only a mad old woman ruining his furniture. Servants whispered that the Duchess carried a revolver with her constantly, even when going to the bathroom. Fear of physical retribution hung in the air. The Duke began to seriously fear for his life. He hired private detectives to watch his own wife in his own home. In the early 1930s, the mask of propriety was finally torn off. The Duke made a decision. He could no longer live with this monster, as he called her in letters to friends. He decided to exile her. But evicting Gladys Deacon was not so simple. She clung to Blenheim with a death grip.
"I am the mistress here," she screamed when the steward tried to hint at her departure.
To evict her, the Duke resorted to extreme measures. He ordered the heating and electricity cut off in her part of the palace. Imagine this picture: a huge stone sack in winter, icy cold, darkness. And in this darkness, wrapped in furs, sits the former beauty of the world, clutching trembling spaniels to her. She refused to leave. She burned books in the fireplace to keep warm. This was agony. The rot destroyed everything: love, respect, beauty, and sanity. All that remained was the naked, animal hatred of two people locked in a golden cage. Gladys lost this war, not when the wax began to flow down her face. She lost it when she believed that the title would save her from loneliness. Now, sitting in the cold, dark palace, she understood. A title is just a word, and cold is physical reality. And this cold penetrated to the very essence of her bones, foreshadowing a swift and inevitable end. In any great tragedy, there comes a moment when fate stops whispering and starts shouting. For Gladys Deacon, this moment stretched over 2 agonizing years. ending with the clang of the closing gates of Blenheim Palace. 1933. The situation in the palace reached absurdity. One of the most powerful aristocrats of the British Empire, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a man owning lands and titles, fled his own home. He simply couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't evict Gladys, who clung to Blenheim's walls like a tick, so he left himself. The Duke moved to a London hotel. Imagine the humiliation of this situation. The palace owner lives in a hotel room, while his mad wife wanders the empty halls of the ancestral nest, surrounded by a pack of unclean spaniels, heating canned food on a spirit lamp because the kitchen doesn't work. This was the complete collapse of the Victorian family model. But Gladys triumphed. It seemed to her that she had won the battle for territory. She remained alone in the castle. She wrote letters to friends full of bravado, not realizing that this was the victory of a captain on a sinking ship. On June 30th, 1934, the final gong sounded. The Duke of Marlborough died. He had cancer, but many contemporaries agreed that stress killed him. Years of scandals, hatred, and living with a woman who was slowly going mad exhausted his resources. He was 62 years old. Her husband's death for Gladys was not a tragedy of losing a loved one. It became a financial and legal catastrophe. In the second when Sonny's heart stopped, Gladys ceased to be the mistress of Blenheim. She instantly turned into a dowager duchess, and the title, power, and most importantly, the keys to the palace, passed to the heir. The new 10th Duke of Marlborough became Sonny's son from his first marriage to Consuelo Vanderbilt, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, whom the family called Bert. And here karma struck. Bert hated Gladys. He hated her with fierce, cold hatred. He remembered how she destroyed his mother's marriage. He remembered how she humiliated his father. He saw what she had turned the great legacy of his ancestors into: a dirty kennel with a mad old woman at the head. Bert had not a drop of his father's sentimentality. He was not going to flee to a hotel. He was going to conduct a purge. Gladys hoped that her husband's will would protect her. She counted on generous maintenance and the right to reside, but when the lawyers opened the documents, she was in for a shock. The Duke left her exactly as much as the law required, and not a penny more. He had crossed her out of his life, even before he died physically. The eviction began. It was not a polite move. It was a deportation. Imagine this scene, 1935, a gray, rainy English day. Trucks for transporting furniture pull up to Blenheim's grand entrance, where royal carriages once stopped. Servants, now obeying the new young Duke, carry out Gladys's things. She tried to resist. She screamed, threatened, clung to the door frames. But force was not on her side. The new Duke made it clear to her, if she did not leave voluntarily, she would be led out by policemen. This was the point of no return. Gladys Deacon, the woman who had laid 30 years of her life, her reputation, and her face on the altar of this palace, was thrown out onto the street like a servant caught stealing silver. She exited through the north portico. She looked up. From the ceiling, those same blue eyes gazed at her, which she had ordered painted several years ago. "I am still here," the painted eyes seemed to say. "You are no longer here," the echo of the empty corridors replied. She took with her everything she could, and it was a pitiful sight. Not only jewels and dresses, she was taking with her some unimaginable junk. Old newspapers, broken dolls, boxes of letters. Her madness, which within the palace walls looked like the eccentricity of an aristocrat, on the street turned into an obvious illness. The world she had hunted for so long turned away from her instantly. London's high society breathed a sigh of relief. No one sent her a telegram of sympathy. To them, she was that awful American who got what she deserved. The Cinderella story turned inside out. The carriage turned into a pumpkin, and the palace vanished, leaving the heroine on the roadside in rags. Gladys moved to a small house in the village, and then began her endless wanderings, changing one dwelling for another, each time more modest, more neglected. It was at this moment, in the mid-1930s, that the final break in her psyche occurred. She decided that the world was the enemy. She began to build her own fortress, no longer from marble and gold, but from trash and paranoia. She changed her name. She began calling herself Mrs. Spencer. She renounced the title that had brought her so much pain, although she continued to keep the crested paper. She began to disappear. The great beauty died on the day the gates of Blenheim closed behind her. Only the shell remained. A face disfigured by wax, a hunted gaze, and suitcases stuffed with memories of a life that turned out to be fake. Ahead of her lay another 40 years of life. 40 long, empty years. But this was no longer the life of a social lioness. This was the life of a ghost, wandering the earth, frightening children, and hiding from mirrors. The tragedy was complete. The curtain fell, but the actress remained on stage, forgetting that the play was over and the auditorium empty. After the expulsion from Blenheim Palace, time for Gladys Deacon seemed to coil into a tight, painful spiral. The era began that historians call the Great Levelling, which she perceived as a personal apocalypse. World War II destroyed the remnants of the world in which she had been queen. Taxes soared to the heavens, great estates were demolished by bulldozers because aristocrats could no longer maintain them. The era of the Gilded Age finally passed into oblivion, replaced by an era of concrete, socialism, and practicality. But Gladys refused to accept the new reality. She bought a farm called Grange in the village of Chacombe, not far from Banbury. The name sounded pastoral, almost idyllic. It seemed the former Duchess had decided to find peace in nature. But what was happening behind the high fence of Grange Farm had nothing to do with pastoral. It was the architecture of madness. Gladys turned the farm into a bunker. She surrounded the territory with barbed wire. Warning signs appeared on the gates. She was no longer Gladys Deacon, Proust's muse and the world's most beautiful woman. For the locals, she became Mad Mrs. Spencer, an urban legend, a bogeyman with which mothers scared disobedient children. It was here that the most terrifying phase of her fall unfolded: Diogenes syndrome, or pathological hoarding. Imagine the interior of this house. It was an anti-exhibition. If in Blenheim every vase stood in its place, here things lived their own wild life. Gladys dragged everything into the house. Old newspapers, which she never read, were stacked up to the ceiling, forming narrow labyrinthine passages through which the mistress moved sideways. Empty tin cans, broken umbrellas, rags, all this mixed with genuine treasures. This was a horrific mathematics of the curse. The value of things lost meaning for her. In one room, among rotting potato peels, lay a painting by Degas. In a cheap biscuit tin covered with a layer of greasy dust lay letters from Winston Churchill. A pearl necklace, once valued at tens of thousands of pounds, was used as a rope to tie up a stack of waste paper. She slept on the couch, buried under chinchilla fur coats eaten by moths. She stopped throwing out trash. She stopped cleaning up after her animals. Cats and dogs lived in the house as masters. The smell of ammonia ate into the walls. Once, she spent hours choosing perfumes. Now she smelled so bad that shopkeepers in the village store recoiled when she came in to buy bread. But the most terrible was her parting with mirrors. In the Grange house, there were no reflective surfaces. All mirrors were either broken, covered, or painted over with black paint. Gladys declared war on her own reflection. The paraffin under the skin completed its work. Her chin hung like a heavy sack. Her face was lumpy, distorted. She wore wide-brimmed hats and veils, and often rubber boots combined with a man's overcoat. She only left the house at night, like a ghost. She wandered the fields, talking to herself in 5 languages. Local residents who saw this figure in the fog crossed themselves. They did not know that this strange old woman in rubber boots once made the heart of the German crown prince beat faster. Her financial situation was a paradox. She was not poor in the literal sense. She had jewels worth millions of dollars. She had accounts. But her mental poverty was absolute. She lived worse than a homeless person, possessing a queen's capital. She economized on matches and candles, sitting in the dark while in a chest under the bed lay diamonds capable of lighting up an entire city. This was the total disintegration of personality. Gladys Deacon died long before her physical death. Only the shell remained, obsessed with preserving the past. She kept every scrap of paper, every 50-year-old receipt, as if these documents could prove that she still existed, that she was still important. She became a prisoner of her own memory. In her head, the music of 1900s balls still sounded. The compliments of Italian poets still echoed. But reality knocked on the windows, with tree branches and the howl of the wind. By the beginning of the 1960s, the situation had become critical. The house began to physically collapse. The roof leaked, the floors rotted. Gladys, who was over 80, lived in conditions incompatible with life. She cooked food on a Primus stove standing right on the floor amid the trash. She ate straight from the pot, with hands that once held ostrich feather fans. Neighbors began complaining about the smell and the rats. Social services tried to intervene, but she met them with pitchforks or barricaded the doors. "This is my castle," she screamed through the closed door. "Get out!" She defended her pile of trash just as fiercely as she once defended her rights to Blenheim. For her, there was no difference between a palace and a dump. Both were her territory, her fortress, the only place where she could hide her face from the world that rejected her. The Great Fall was complete. The woman who wanted to become a symbol of beauty became a symbol of decay. Her life turned into a grotesque installation about vanity. All her ambitions, all her intrigues, all her sacrifices led her to this cold, dirty house in the wilderness, where the only witnesses to her greatness were starving cats and rats. But even in this hell, she retained remnants of pride. When the orderlies finally came to take her away, she put on her best jewels, even if moth-eaten. She left not as a patient, but as a deposed empress being led to the scaffold. The story of Gladys Deacon could have ended in that dirty room of the farmhouse, among rats and old newspapers. But great stories always have an epilogue that turns everything upside down. For Gladys, this epilogue came after her death, turning the forgotten mad old woman into a legend worth more than gold today. She died on October 13, 1977, in St. Andrew's Psychiatric Hospital. She was 96 years old. She outlived her husband, the Duke of Marlborough, by 43 years. She outlived her beauty, her mind, and her era. At her funeral, in the village of Chacombe, there were only a few people. No state flags, no obituaries on the front page of the Times, just a mound of earth on a country graveyard. It seemed the world had finally erased her with an eraser. But a year later, in 1978, a sensation occurred in London. Christie's auction house announced sales titled "The Casket of Particularly Important Jewels." These were items found in the trash at Grange Farm. Experts clearing the piles in the house of the mad Mrs. Spencer could not believe their eyes. From shoeboxes, wrapped in greasy newspapers from the 1930s, they extracted treasures considered lost. On that day, the world gasped. Tiaras, brooches with huge diamonds, emeralds gifted by emperors, all this shone under the auction room spotlights just as brightly as in 1905. The dirt was washed away. Pure carats remained. These sales brought fabulous sums. People paid not just for the stones, they paid for a touch of the myth. Gladys Deacon returned to high society posthumously, and her return was triumphant. But what is her true legacy today, in 2025? If you visit Blenheim Palace now, you will see that the Dukes of Marlborough have learned to monetize their history. The palace thrives. Blockbusters are filmed here, from Harry Potter to James Bond movies. The fashion house Dior held its shows here, paying tribute to the style that Gladys once set. But the most poignant monument remains that very north portico. Tourists taking selfies at the entrance often do not even notice that they are being watched. On the ceiling, amid the classical stucco, huge painted blue eyes remain wide open to this day. In 1928, the Duke of Marlborough begged to paint them over. He hated that gaze. But Gladys insisted, and today it has become the main metaphor of her life. The flesh rotted away. The wax that disfigured her face disappeared with the body. But her idealized image, her gaze, her will, remained part of the stone. She achieved her goal. She became inseparable from Blenheim. You cannot remove Gladys Deacon from the palace without destroying the ceiling. She has embedded herself into the building's structure, just as that very paraffin embedded itself into her skin. Her story rings eerily relevant today. Gladys Deacon is the patron saint of the Instagram era and plastic surgery. She was the first biohacker of beauty. She was the first to decide that a face is just a draft that can be edited. Look at modern celebrities, at faces on social media distorted by fillers, at identical fox eyes and plump lips. Gladys did this 120 years ago. She paid for this experiment with her sanity and loneliness. Her fate is a cruel warning. The attempt to stop time with a syringe always ends in defeat. Nature always takes revenge. In 2020, writer Hugo Vickers, the very man who found her in the asylum and brought her name back from oblivion, reissued her biography. The book became a bestseller. People started talking about her again. Not as a mad woman, but as a woman of incredible strength and tragic mistake. What remained of her wealth? Nothing. The money dissolved. The jewels lie in the safes of collectors in Asia and America. Grange Farm was long ago sold and rebuilt, but the paradox with which we began remains. Gladys Deacon wanted to become a deity. She wanted to be worshipped. She destroyed her life in pursuit of an unattainable ideal. And, by the irony of fate, she got what she wanted, only in the most perverted way. She became an immortal story, a bogeyman for children and an icon for aesthetes. Her life proves the old, cynical truth of the Gilded Age. You have to pay for everything. If you want a title, you pay with freedom. If you want a palace, you pay with warmth. If you want eternal beauty, you pay with your face. The final scene of our film is neither a graveyard nor an auction. We return to Blenheim. Night. The palace is closed to tourists. In the empty, echoing corridors, silence reigns. And only in the north portico, in the darkness, barely illuminated by the moon, two huge eyes glow. They have seen the rise of the British Empire and its fall. They have seen 2 world wars. They have seen dukes and fashions change. They have seen everything, except one thing: their own happiness. Gladys Deacon is still watching, and in this gaze there is no longer arrogance or pain, only the cold eternity of stone. She has finally become a statue, perfect, motionless, and absolutely, infinitely lonely.